propaganda and disinformation. And you have to remember that what Joe Biden, his son Hunter was making a profit during it, but Joe Biden, who was vice president of Obama in 2013, 2014, when the United States State Department, through the National Endowment for Democracy, which is really a front for the CIA, overthrew the government of Ukraine and brought in a bunch of Nazis, followers of Stepan Bandera, who was the great collaborator of Adolf Hitler and brutally murdered tens of thousands of Jews, Poles, and Russians during World War II. And you had groups like what everyone's heard of, the Azov Battalion, the Svoboda Party, the C-14, which are white supremacist Nazi organizations, but they're not just fringe. They have their own paid brigades, etc. And from 2014 to 2022, in those 8 years, they had killed 14,000 Russian-speaking people in the Donbass region. This is why the people of Crimea voted in a referendum to leave Ukraine and return to the Russian Federation. And there's news coming out now, which really should not be a surprise, on the Ukrainian government trying to cover up for atrocious war crimes that are being committed against the Russian prisoners of war, to the point because videos have been circulating showing horrific kinds of injuries and tortured deaths of these prisoners in the hands of these Ukrainian Nazi brigades. So now the Ukrainian government is trying to make sure that the Red Cross doesn't get access to any Russian prisoners of war, or to try and find a few quote unquote model Russian prisoners so they can say that nothing like that is going on. The other thing that was reported by Kirillov, who is the Russian expert on biological and chemical warfare, is that they have found that in the United States run bio research laboratories, they were doing experiments on Ukrainian soldiers, which led to the death of 20 of them, led to the hospitalization of 400 of them. The kind of diseases that they were working on were anthrax, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, and leptospirosis. And it turns out that one of these companies, Metabiota's representative in Ukraine, was someone named Mary Gutierrez, the vice president of the company, and very, very close friends with Hunter Biden. So these are just things to know that's coming out. Kirillov said, quote, the termination of the activities of 5 Kiev biolaboratories, which worked with pathogens of anthrax, tularemia, brucellosis, cholera, leptospirosis, and African swine fever, is an important result of the Russian Armed Forces special operation that is terminating those facilities. Also, they seem to have evidence that Ukraine in December of last year was trying to purchase delivery systems, unmanned drone type things that could have perhaps spread these pathogens in neighboring Russia. So unlike John Brennan, formerly of the CIA, now of MSNBC, I think, or CNN, or one of these networks, who said they don't do evidence, the Russians are very careful to document what they're talking about because they know they'll be accused of making things up and war propaganda. So I just say this to remind people that everything that you're being told about the situation is a lie, and that the purpose of the sanctions and the intention to crush Russia has nothing to do with a so-called Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that Ukraine is being used, just as Afghanistan was being used, for a geopolitical operation of this bankrupt Anglo-Dutch system. And what we're going to be hearing about tonight is the solution to that. And before I turn it over to Rich Freeman, I would just really like to encourage everybody to see the schillerinstitute.com website, because there's going to be a major international conference on Saturday, April 9th, beginning at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, to take up this question of convoking a conference of nations to establish a new security and development architecture. So with that, I will turn it over to Richard Freeman of Executive Intelligence Review.
Thanks, Diane. What I would like to look at is to give people a sense of this document, which you can get on our website. It's probably going to be poor, but it's the LaRouche plan for a new international economic architecture, which was put together by an international team under the direction of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and we just released it on the 28th of March. What we're looking at now is a few of the economic policies that have been, some of them around for the last 70 years, intersecting a crazed operation led by the British to try and turn a war or a situation into an international nuclear war, at the same time taking out the economic system, and at the same time taking out Russia and China. This is one package. It's not three separate operations. What we are seeing now is, with the floating exchange rate system, tremendous levels of speculation, the hyperinflation, which we've documented on other shows, led by, of course, the Federal Reserve's printing $4.9 trillion worth of money to bail out a collapsing banking system, sanctions, which are a form of economic warfare, and a COVID pandemic, which, by the way, America has just passed the 1 million deaths, and worldwide it's 6.17 million deaths, with almost 500 million people having been infected. And this is not over either. And in that situation, you have a provocation. Now, what we need to do is look at what we can build out of this, because this is a terrible situation, a confluence of these crises, and yet at the same time, some of the most important changes in world history, if you look back over several thousand years, have come during periods of crisis, which have shaken cultures to their roots, and that's where we are right now. I will say that what we're looking at, and I'm going to give a few features of this, of each of the features. We're going to look at what this new system could look like with some specificity. We've put this out. Lyndon LaRouche has published things on this, beginning with Earth's first 50 years and an International Development Bank proposal that he made in 1976. But we have certain specifics on what we think can be done. We're going to look at the effect of the sanctions and how they're intensifying rather than making anything workable. And we're going to look at what Russia, India, China, which is called the RIC, Russia, India, China, which was the foundation stone for what became the BRICS. And finally, a plan, if time permits, for our development of Ukraine, because Ukraine needs development, but rather than being used as a marcher lord for the British, particularly people like Liz Truss, but higher levels of the City of London oligarchy, we see it as a bridge, a link along the Belt and Road to bring Eurasia, those parts of Western and Eastern Europe and Asia, together as an integrated feature. So into this situation, what is happening with the sanctions, and I'll just identify this, is the United States has used the dollar. Now, this is criminal because we don't have a foreign policy. Our foreign policy has largely been, for the last 15 to 20 years, to attack smaller nations like Iraq and so forth, Libya, and Syria, and also to use the fact that the dollar was once an important instrument back after World War II, when America produced 43% of all world manufacturing, and therefore trade is conducted in the dollar. So to take that as a legacy, because we're not producing at the levels we used to, not even the levels we did in the 1960s under President John F. Kennedy, but to take that instrument and say, we will tell you what you must do or not do, because otherwise we will sanction your use of the dollar. And we will say to you as a nation, you cannot make this trade in dollars, since about 62% of all world trade is still in dollars. And therefore, we use this as an instrument to crush nations when there is nothing in international law, nothing in natural law, nothing in any validity of the dollar as it is right now, because as Diane correctly called it, it is a London-based dollar. But we use it as a legacy to suffocate nations. What we're looking at potentially is that the world will go into two blocks. One, a NATO, British, American, European bloc based on the dollar. And although not all of Europe is united, we have many instances of that becoming increasingly clear that many European nations want nothing to do with this. And then we have Russia, China, India, and I would include in this countries which are now very forcefully resisting: Iran, South Africa, Argentina, Indonesia, Hungary, who are saying, we don't want a nuclear war and we don't want to go and destroy Russia and China. And the statement that President Biden made, that Putin should not remain as president, was not a slip, it was not a gaffe. It's actual policy. It has been enunciated by 3 different people over the last 2.5 weeks. So we know that this is fundamental policy. Does Biden grasp what he's saying? It's very likely he doesn't, but he likes the feel of what he's doing right now on behalf of a British, real fascist operation. So this could split the world. We don't want that. But what we're going to show you is what can be done to at least break out of this dollar, not because we're anti-American, but because the dollar is no longer a sovereign currency of the United States. So what I would like to do is identify for you what this Russia, India, China bloc would look like. And again, what we're looking towards is if you can break the power of the City of London and the oligarchy, you could reintegrate America, Germany, France, Japan into a sane relationship. But we have to first break that relationship. Not that we're even forcing the events. Most of these are caused by insane economic policies. May I have the first graph, please? Okay, if you can see this, we've taken Russia, India, China, and then we summed up what they do under RIC for Russia, India, China. And then we take the world, whatever that is in that category, and then we say what is RIC as a percent. So to just summarize, the Russia, India, China, or RIC, has 38% of the world's population, 42% of its wheat production, 45% of its fertilizer production, 23% of its natural gas production. New nuclear capacity is 45% of the world. Coal reserves 65% of the world. Steel 66% of the world. Electrified rail 55%. I hope I'm not going too fast. You can see this and you can study this in the report, which is posted on the Schiller website. This is a core that is extremely important. This is more production than if you added all of the EU and Britain, which is in the EU, but sort of has stationed itself at a distance so it can manipulate certain things, and the United States and Canada in most of these categories. So you have a physical basis if they are forced against the wall. And there's no giving up. This is relentless. We're going to destroy Russia. We're going to destroy China. And if anyone learned anything from World War II, Russia and China will never, ever submit. And if you don't know that, you should not be doing what you're doing in terms of leadership. Russia lost 26 million people. China lost 21 million people. Between the two of them, they lost 61% of all the deaths in World War II. And what Putin has been trying to educate people on for the last 2 years is that Russia knows this history. This event did not start last year. It didn't start in 2014. Didn't even start in 1991. It's an historical process that goes back before World War II. So in this setting, what we're going to look at is this. What would be the steps if this group were to constitute itself as a core for a new world economic system with directed credit under the work of LaRouche. And several of the key people in this are people like Sergei Glaziev, like Justin Lin Yifu, who are people who've been in touch with us for 20 to 25 years. That's what these events like we're going to have on April 9th are about. They're not just talking. We're trying to take the best people who are visionaries who think for the future so that when we reach a point of crisis like this, these are people who might be in place to put something good in place for what is right now currently destroying the world. So just quickly, and we can review some of these things afterwards, we will build a real physical economy of these three countries with others. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Council. You have the Belt and Road, which has over 140 nations. There are many countries that want this sort of development, but they've been too terrified or too intimidated to break out and do that. So we will deal with the physical economy, and I've shown you some of the parameters, and we're going to have to go into machine tooling, nuclear fission, nuclear fusion. That'll be a core point. Second, fixed exchange rates. No more floating exchange rate system, which we got August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve system. Not the gold system, gold reserve. There's a very, very big difference. The third thing we're going to do, and this is elaborated in the report, I'm just going to identify it, and if people have questions, we can go back. There's a full set capital and exchange controls. That means you cannot speculate against the ruble, and we will probably have a golden ruble, a golden renminbi. That's the name of the Chinese currency, which is the yuan domestically. Internationally, it's called the renminbi. And the Indian rupee. And there are already discussions going on among leading people on how to put this type of architecture together. But it has to be based ultimately on production, on the productive capacity of increasing relative potential population density. But you will set up a situation where you can't speculate, you can't move money in and out. It's called capital controls, and the Russians have that. Anybody who's exporting, if they get foreign currency in like pounds or euros or dollars, must deposit it with the central bank. And then the central bank will distribute it to those people in that country, in Russia, so they can use it for what purposes they have. They are not going to honor certain types of obligations. They will pay their debts. Russia always has. So you're going to control the capital flowing in and out. You're going to control the currency, but you're going to do it from a dirigistic, domestic directed policy of preserving the so that capital flows and speculators cannot penetrate that operation. We will put this RICS Plus together at the center, along with Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. There are many countries that are already ready to go on this sort of thing. We don't know all the parameters because we're not in these discussions, but we do have, from this press and other things, very, very clear idea on this. The Russians and Indians, for example, just discussed setting up a rupee, which is the Indian currency, ruble rate for purchases of oil, for purchases of capital goods going back and forth. These things are already in the works. How far they develop is going to be partly determined by us, and I'm very serious about that. We're going to have US and Europe join the Belt and Road, and once this situation starts to get into operation, and we're going to reconstruct Ukraine as a model example of what can do if we have the four powers collaborating for something good. We can rebuild Ukraine after we've kicked out the British and kicked out the Nazis. Now, I want to say that what I'm going to present to you is something about what's happening, how the sanctions are taking a policy from when we went off to the gold reserve system, and it's going to bring down a collapse. This means that we will not go back to where we were. When you enter a new universe, the old universe no longer functions. It's finished. It's gone. If we don't do this the right way, then we will not be able, we'll have the interbank market, I'll say what that is in a little while, freeze up, which means the banks cannot clear accounts, which means you can't pay payroll, you can't finance home loans, and people will not be able to withdraw cash or credit, it'll be very much like Afghanistan. Afghanistan is facing genocide. We will face that in the United States. This was happened before, it will happen again. And at that point, you will be into a new system. And let me just say, Bill Ferguson did a very nice job, a very good job, and of course Lynn has. Once Planck discovered the idea that you have photon packets which transmit light, and there's no continuity. You learn a color wheel when you're in school, but there's no color wheel. Every light that's done by black body radiation actually is some integral of Planck's constant. And once it was understood that that was the way, and then Einstein took that further and started doing work on the speed of light in his special relativity, and then took other considerations in the general relativity. In that period between 1905, not really 1902, and 1915, 1916, all of physics was changed. Every piece of physics before that was different because you have an entire integral system as a whole. Systems of physics and of knowledge are whole systems. Every part is affected. We're going into a new system which will be completely different than anything you're experiencing today. So let me just take you through a couple of the parameters of this so that you can see this. And that's great. If we were able to do this and not get into a nuclear war, then this is something that's a tremendous opportunity. It's very dangerous, but it's great opportunities. It was a war for 130 years that led to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So what we have to look at is the following. What will the sanctions do? And I just want to give you a few predicates of what the sanctions are doing, because once you realize this, you'll see that the United States, Britain, and others are shooting themselves in the foot with the types of sanctions that we have. We will be cut off from raw materials. Of the 42 leading raw materials you have, China, Russia, along with, I compared Kazakhstan, but you could also add in there Belarus and one or two other countries. They produce between 30 and 90% of all the leading raw materials in the world. And that includes everything from copper and iron ore and so forth, steel. But let me just give you an example. They control more than 70% of a third of those 42 materials. For example, they control vanadium, which is what makes steel vibration resistant and also it can resist steel shocks. 85% of the world's graphite, 86% of the world's bismuth, 87% of the tungsten, 87% of the mercury, 91% of the asbestos. These three countries. 98% of gallium, which is essential in most high-tech fields that you're in, from computer chips and so forth. These will be cut off if we keep pursuing in this direction. Who benefits? Does Joe Biden even think about this? They are so super hyped up that they're not even thinking about some of the most basic policies. Space, which Joel, my colleague, Diane's colleague, who's on the show, could talk about. But what's happened is that the ExoMars mission, which was being done with Russia and Europe, will be shut down because Europe said we're not going to work with Russians on space. In fact, 5 missions that were planned will be stopped. The use of Kourou in French Guiana, which is a launch site for the European Space Agency, will be stopped. COVID. Russia produced something called, as people know, Sputnik V for victory. That's a 2-dose shot, and Sputnik Light, which is a 1-dose shot. And it's produced by the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is headed by Dmitry Kirillov. And this has contracts for 700 million doses in India, doses in Mexico. 3 million people in Mexico City have already been inoculated which is a very effective drug, was put in Lancet that there was a 91.6% effectiveness. The British had tried to shut this down until Lancet ran a study saying on 20,000 patients, this was the effectiveness of the drug. What did the British do on March 1st? They sanctioned the Russian Direct Investment Fund and its chairman, which means COVID vaccines, which could be saving millions of lives, will be stopped. Where's the military threat in that? It's cutting off people who need this, especially in the developing sector. Nuclear, I'll just mention these quickly. Russia is the leading nuclear exporter in the world. They have 38 plants themselves, have another 27 planned for Russia, another 21 are in the planning stages. So, you can do the math, that's 86 plants. But they have largely built or are building plants. Armenia, 1, Bangladesh, 2, Bulgaria, 2 plants, Belarus, 2 plants, China, they built 8 plants, Egypt, 4 plants, which is at the center of Egypt's development, Finland, 1 plant, Hungary, 4 plants, India, 4 plants, and there's another 3 being planned for India, Iran, 3 plants, Slovakia, 4 plants, Ukraine. Russia's been negotiating with many countries, but particularly with Africa. And I just want you to see what these sanctions are really directed at. In a 2018 BRICS conference, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, Putin spoke, and I just want to read you one quote he said. I would especially like to note that Russia is planning to step up its assistance in development of national energy in African states. In the nuclear power industry, we offer our African partners the creation of an entire industry on a turnkey basis, meaning brand new. You're turnkey, you're making it anew. Agreements on cooperation in the field of atoms for peace have been signed with a number of countries in the region, while in some of them the work has acquired a practical dimension, meaning they've actually signed contracts with 6 different countries and they have others which are pending. All of these projects will be of strategic for Africa, where according to different estimates, as many as 600 million people still live without electricity. They want to shut this down because most of those contracts were in dollars. They want to do the same to China. So we go through in this report, and I think I've given some examples. I also just want to mention what the inflation is, because this is so absurd. And that's why I was saying that this can blow out the problems that we've built up over the last 40 years, and then within that, the last 20 years, and so forth. West Texas Intermediate Crude, that's the standard for pricing oil in the United States. It's actually based, the trading market is in Oklahoma, but it's called West Texas Intermediate Crude. On December 20th, 2021 was $68 a barrel. On March 21st, it was $112 a barrel. That's a 65% increase. In Europe, the price has gone up 83%. Thermal coal, that's the coal that you build in the burn in the power plant. December 21st of last year, $134 per ton. March 7th, $460 per ton, a 3.4 times increase. That's your energy. You get electricity from either nuclear or gas or coal. Now, they don't include energy in the consumer price index, very convenient, and housing, which has gone bananas. The price of homes have gone up 24% since last year this time. That's the general inflation. But what we're looking at, and I would like the listeners to think of it, think of a huge bubble. Think of all the problems inherent in it, and then you intersect it with a nut, which was caused by the Great Reset, which was caused by the acid inflation policy since the 1970s, and so forth. And then you intersect that with this type of things that are coming out of these sanctions. And to give you a sense of shockwave, because we've used this term many times on this show, but I just want to give you a concrete one. What firefighters fear most when they're fighting a fire is what's called the back waves, where things get so hot that a shock wave is produced. All this air is oxygen is sucked out of the building. And at that point, you get a both physical and a heat effect. And that's when buildings disintegrate, even brick buildings. That's what we're headed into. It's not a 3% increase of inflation here or something like that. That's true. It's that process which is unfolding, which Lyndon LaRouche identified as a shockwave effect. There's many other ways for dealing with that. Now, the other financial sides, and again, I'm just going to touch on this right now, is that the Fed is talking about the fact that they've built such a great bubble that 3 members of the Fed Board of Governors, Raphael Bostic, James Ballard, and Christopher Wallace, they have called for multiple increases of 0.5% because we've had this quantitative easing. Multiple, maybe 5.5%, not 5%, 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.5%. Because they're caught on their own criminal activity. It's not, they were protecting speculation for the last number of years. But if you throw that in with our hyperinflation in gas, hyperinflation in food, fertilizer prices are up 70%. And one of the gentlemen who is a specialist in this area, who deals with one of the largest companies in the world that deals with fertilizer, says if you have a sanctions which eliminate fertilizer, and don't forget 43% of all fertilizer comes from Russia, India, and China, and you could throw in Kazakhstan, then you will have a 50% drop in food yields. That in a world where now 800 million people, because the figure's been revised upward, are completely food insecure. Genocide mixed with stupidity. Oh, we're winning the war. They're not in the real world. So the other side of this, which I just want to mention, is this. The European Federation of Energy Traders, which has large trades, on March 16th asked central banks to provide, quote, limited emergency liquidity support to ensure that the whole gas and power markets continue to function. That's a way of saying we are totally afraid this is all going to blow out. We need emergency stuff. Remember back in 2007, 2008, when 19 trillion was committed as credit lines for all sorts of things to keep the system from going. And the geniuses who run the city of London and so forth, they simply said, okay, we'll inflate. And then, as I said, think of what happens when a building that's on fire reaches a certain temperature stage. It's a physical change. It's not just you're adding so many more degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius. It's a physical process change. Now, lastly, what I'd like to do, and I just want to give one quick quote. This is from something called Wall Street and Parade. It's run by Russ and Pamela Martins. They wrote on March 7th, because there's credit default swaps against Russian debt. We can take that up with credit default swaps are, but they're completely insane. And there's 41 billion of those that are outstanding among American and British banks. And they'll go under if they keep forcing this financial question. And they wrote, quote, you have the making of a replay of the 2008 banking crisis, when banks backed away from lending to each other because they didn't know who would fall next from this toxic subprime exposure. That led to a liquidity crisis and the unprecedented involvement of the Federal Reserve pumping trillions of dollars into the mega banks of Wall Street and their foreign derivatives contracts. That's what we're inches from. You won't see it in any headline, but that's what we're tracking. Now, the last thing I'd like to do is just tell you something about Ukraine, because Ukraine was taken apart at the same time Russia was taken apart. And this is in 1991. I am just going to refer this to you and then we can talk about it. In 1941, in June, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which was the largest invasion ever. 160,000 vehicles, millions of troops, went all the way from Finland straight down south, and they swept across the border into Russia. In 1991, at the point at which Russia's economy they disintegrated, the Soviet Union disintegrated. I call what happened next Operation Barbarossa II, because it was a plan that had nothing to do with trying to make Russia a free market economy or anything. It was very aptly said by Sergei Glaziev in the book, which was published by ER and you can get your hands on. And he just called it genocide. The life expectancy of males plummeted by 6 years. People had nothing to live on. Companies were sold off pennies on the dollar. And the idea was to destroy Russia then. And again, I just want to say this to you. Putin knows this. Lavrov knows this. Shoigu, who's the head of the military, defense chief, knows this. Gerasimov, who's the head of the military, he's chief of staff of the military, knows this. Many, many Russians know this. They are not going to submit on this question. So what I would like to show you is the next chart. So what happens is a person you've seen before, her name is Natalia Vitrenko. She went through the effects up through 2012. So we're going to take 1991 to 2012. Let me just tell you, this is from an article. It was actually a presentation Natalia made April 13th through 14th at 2013, and you can find it in the May 3rd, 2013 issue of EIR. I would really recommend you read it. It's an excellent article. And she's a person with real courage and a major intellect, not like this pygmy Zelensky. She wrote, whereas Ukraine used to have 16 major machine tool plants. This is now she's comparing 1991 with 2012, because what was done to Russia was done to Ukraine. The bankers didn't care. Whereas Ukraine used to have 16 major machine tool plants, which produced 37,000 machine tools in 1990. Now there are only 3 plants left, which barely on their feet, and they produce just 40 machine tools a year. And she documents in this article that over 22 years, Ukraine's electricity production had fallen 35%, its rolled steel production had dropped 57%, its tractor production collapsed 94.3%, and they lost 12 million jobs, and people got progressively poorer and poorer. And then at a critical point, in 2013, the then president of Ukraine, whose name is Viktor Yanukovych, decided in November 21st not to go with the plan to join the EU. But what is generally not known is what he was doing. On December 3rd, but he knew this in advance, because when you make a diplomatic trip, you don't just plan it like on a Sunday and I'll see you on Monday. These take months to put out. On December 3rd through 6th, Yanukovych went to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping in the great halls of the people, and joined the Belt and Road. And the Belt and Road was only 3 months old. It had been formed in September of 2013 by Xi Jinping. He became one of the first countries to do it. And then China proposed $8 billion worth of investment in Ukraine. And then Dmitry Rogozin, who's the head of the space agency, but back then was the deputy prime minister of Russia, made a tour of Ukraine December 1st through 3rd, in which he proposed integrating for space and other military purposes the Russian and Ukrainian industries, which had been split asunder, but were really naturally one. And he then met with the prime minister of Ukraine at that time, whose name was Mykola Azarov. She was the prime minister. And the British and the American establishment were horrified. And then you have Maidan. They were not going to let this happen. They were not going to let Ukraine get back on its feet. That wasn't, they call it the revolution of dignity. This was a revolution to prevent Ukraine from ever developing. So that, just be quick on this, if we could show the next Ukraine's labor force. All this is in the report and much more. So you can see the labor force. These are from the Federal Statistical Service of Ukraine. And what happened, if we could, you'll see that Ukraine, after the Yanukovych was deposed on February 24th, I believe, of 2014, and then Yatsenuk was brought in as prime minister 3 days later by Victoria Nuland. In this period, after all the destruction that Natalia has just told you about, in this period, the labor force dropped by 3.96 million workers, or 18.6%. The industrial labor force fell by 26.4%. I'm just doing the percentages, they're not there. The manufacturing labor force, which was part of the industrial labor force, fell by 443,000 workers, 19.5%. So they underwent a second collapse as a result of Maidan. It wasn't just a demonstration, it was to destroy Ukraine. What would we do? What are the steps that have to be taken? Very quickly, we have to restore labor power. We have to bring back into Ukraine 10 million jobs. And this is the question that Lyndon LaRouche comes at. I just want to read you a really quick quote from Lynn in December 7th, 2012 webcast. Lynn said, "We have a population of the planet, and we need every damned individual on this planet. We need them. They have a purpose in existing because they can become more productive. And as they become more productive, then their children become more productive, and so forth. Man's ability to cope with these problems." So we want to add 10 million workers back to the labor force, 4 million of those being industrial workers, of that 2 million being manufacturing. Second, Ukraine now is down to 119,000 manufacturing businesses. We want to increase that by 50% and deepen the ability of those businesses. We want to get into their machine tools, which means we want to bring in Chinese and Swiss and Italian and other German experts to teach their machine tool sector, along with the Ukrainians who have a lot of skills. We have to set up a civilian conservation corps to deal with the youth so that they can actually have night courses and work in the area of building hospitals and health systems, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has designated throughout for the last number of years. Where are the major places that we can build? If I could have the map of Ukraine. This is a map of Ukraine. The legend to the left is Wikipedia's political interpretation. Please disregard that. You'll see on the right Donetsk and Luhansk. And you'll see Mariupol, which is right on the seacoast, right near there. There's also an industrial belt between Donetsk and Mariupol, which is very, very important. But we need to develop that. The Donetsk region, and if you go a little bit over, you'll see Dnipro, D-N-I-P-R-O, and that whole province is called Dnipro, or it's called an oblast, which is a province, Dnipropetrovsk. And those two areas, Donetsk region and that Dnipropetrovsk, is 33% of the industry in output in Ukraine. We want to build it up. And it has some of the most magnificent space industries there, which Joe will get excited about. I'm just going to mention it. They have the Antonov Aeronautics, which builds these huge heavy lifting planes, both for military, but mostly for commercial purposes. But they also have something called Yuzmash and Yuznoi, and they're located in Dnipro, which is called Rocket City. That was the heart of the Russian space program under the Soviet Union, or one of the hearts. And they produce all sorts of spacecraft, which are used, for example, by American companies. They produced 100 rocket launchers, heavy rocket, not, military ballistic rockets, a year. They have this capability. And the three companies, Antonov, Yuzmash, and Yuznoi, have 40,000 workers. They could be producing some of the most advanced rocketry, ballistics, spacecraft. They carry satellites all over the place. And these are very skilled technicians, very skilled engineers. And they could also start building things like machine tools and so forth. Ukraine has very rich black soil, very, very rich. They produce 6 million metric tons of wheat they export, 27 million metric tons of coal that they export, of corn, and 6 million metric tons of barley. They're one of the leading producers of every single thing you can see. That has to be restored, there has to be fertilizer, and that could, under special arrangement, be done with an agreement, say, for example, to feed Africa. And lastly, to do all of this, and more specified in our program, it's going to take somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. And let me just show you one other thing there. If I can have the map of Ukraine again. Actually, the map before that. Okay. Look where Ukraine is on this map. It's smack dab in the middle of the Belt and Road. One of the other things we propose is to build a whole high-speed rail system. I'll just mention it, won't go into it, through Ukraine. That could go from east to west and north to south. Ukraine is located strategically right in the middle. Every country uses the word hub. They really are a hub in this situation. But if we can go back then to the last map, the map of Ukraine, yeah. This whole area can be entirely changed. But to do that, we have to do exactly what LaRouche has been saying for every country. First of all, cancel all the policies of the IMF, the City of London, and so forth. Replace the central bank with a national bank, which will produce the volume of credit we need. We're talking $500 billion to $1 trillion that can go into productive development. And what you want to do, just to conclude, is you want to raise potential population density. Now, what does that mean? Well, certainly you look at what the land does produce and what machinery would allow you to produce at a higher level and infrastructure and so on. But it goes beyond that. You want to put in there a scientific principle which is incorporated in such a way in the economy that it's always planning for the future. And that future is always planning for a further future. And that's the direction we want to take Ukraine as part of the Belt and Road and all the other things I've mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. And if we do that, then this idea of an alternative monetary system, we don't want to split the world, but we don't want the dollar, not that we don't want the dollar, but it's what it's being used for. And that's what we're on the verge of doing. And this conference is coming up on the 9th. I would say to every person listening, Diane could correct me, that you should aim to try and get 10 people to this conference. And if you don't get 10, at least get 2 or 3, call them 10 minutes before the conference, call them during it, and offer to go over with them afterwards a discussion process. We are on the verge of a universal change in the entire world system, as bleak as things look. And it's a very optimistic possibility. And that's what our program that we just assembled is meant to do.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So I think I will go right away to Joel Dejean, who is the LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Congress in Texas in the new 38th district, for his thoughts on all of this. Joel, go ahead.
Thank you, Richie. Bueno, Diane. Thought this was the Italian Symposium. But I wanted to reference an article that was republished in today's Executive Intelligence Review dated April 1st, 2022, from Lyndon LaRouche. It was first published in 1996, in July of 1996. It's called SDI, the Technical Side of Grand Strategy. And this is part of the LaRouche plan that Richie went through. But the Strategic Defense Initiative was a key component and still is of LaRouche's plan. Now, I remember the SDI like it was yesterday. I remember the speech that Reagan gave in March of 1983, because I was working on some of the conventional weapons that Reagan was accelerating. I had just gotten back from a series of successful flight tests in Eglin Air Force Base in the panhandle of Florida. And I heard that Reagan was going to give a speech about defense that night. So I watched the speech, and when he got to the part where he asked the scientific cadre of the United States, which gave us nuclear weapons, to work to develop the technologies to make these weapons impotent and obsolete, I felt he was talking directly to me. That's how excited I was. Now, at that time, I thought these were the words of Reagan. I didn't know that Lyndon LaRouche had conceived the plan. As a matter of fact, at that time, I didn't even know LaRouche. But over the next 2 years, I came to know LaRouche because I ran into some LaRouche organizers in Los Angeles during a trip out there. And Reagan did not go through the technical side of his plan. So after supporting Reagan's re-election, I was contacted by General Danny Graham's campaign called High Frontier, which was using off-the-shelf technology. Now, Reagan wasn't talking about off-the-shelf technology. He was talking about developing new principles. But as I came to read what LaRouche had meant by this strategic defense, he wasn't talking about missiles against missiles. He was talking about relativistic beam technology, laser beams, particle beams. Now, to give you a reference, a laser beam travels 1,000,000 times faster than any spacecraft or hypersonic warhead or hypersonic missile. So that would give the advantage to the defense over any offense. And in this paper reprinted today, Lynn goes through that in quite some detail. So he wasn't talking about some piece of technology, a weapon system. He was talking about a series of breakthroughs that would lead not only to a defense, so we could have mutual assured survival instead of mutual assured destruction, but he was talking about using these advances in the machine tool industry, using laser machine tools, high-powered lasers. And then when I met LaRouche physically in New Hampshire in 1987, he gave a speech that went beyond the SDI, beyond the strategic defense, because he went through his plan for 40 years Moon-Mars mission, where you would use plasma technologies, fusion technologies, optical biophysics, computer technologies to have a colony on Mars over the coming 40 years. Now, in that speech, Lynn goes through how we would have a 1 terawatt fusion rocket to get to Mars in a matter of days. He wasn't talking about using off-the-shelf chemical technology like Elon Musk talks about. He was talking about using the latest technology, the technologies we developed for the defense of US, Russia, and eventually the Earth, but use those technologies to push the boundary of the development of space. Now, that is why I joined to help get LaRouche and his message out. And the reaction against that put LaRouche in prison during the time when the Soviet Union came apart. And Richie went through some of the results of how the potential of that collapse was destroyed by the British. Now, a lot of you may be shocked to hear that LaRouche's fourth law, which is on a crash program of fusion, has been discussed in the Congress and in the White House of all places over the last few weeks. Now, in November of last year, there was a seminar in the Congress chaired by the Committee on Science and Technology, which went through some of the breakthroughs that have occurred in laser and magnetic fusion. We covered some of that. Now, 2 weeks ago, there was a 3-hour conference in the White House. Now, a lot of it began with all this usual crap about climate change and lowering your carbon dioxide and all that. But what came through is the breakthroughs that are occurring at the National Ignition Facility, the Joint European Torus, the small private funded magnetic fusion programs like Commonwealth Fusion Systems and various companies around the country. Now, there was almost zero coverage of that. New York Times didn't even mention it. But you have right now, with this plan that Helga LaRouche is putting out for a new strategic and economic development architecture, combine that with what LaRouche has laid out for a Moon-Mars mission and a strategic defense of the Earth, we could turn this planet around virtually overnight. And that's what I intend to focus on with my campaign. And we're going to be covering some of that in the upcoming April 9th conference. So I encourage everyone to sign up. And definitely, if you haven't already, read that article from LaRouche in today's EIR, dated April 1st.
Great. Thanks very much. So there's a few questions that have come in. I'm going to just quickly read them all and people can take up what they would like to. One person asks, would cryptocurrency allow you to bypass this? I think means the crisis. Someone asks, what can we do to protect ourselves? Someone else asks about the gold-backed ruble, saying the Duma has approved Russian banks to sell gold to investors for foreign currencies, while they also have announced they will buy gold at 5,000 rubles per gram. And would you comment on that? I would first like to take up where Joel left off and really, what can we do to protect ourselves? You know, I've often thought, because the crisis is severe and we really are facing food shortages of a massive scale. And we saw how fragile our supply lines were at the beginning of the pandemic, where people may remember a little bit of panic and all of a sudden you go to the grocery store and there's no meat, no toilet paper. I still don't quite understand why that's the first thing that gets hoarded. But at any rate, suddenly there was nothing there, and that causes very real panic. And you have an impulse to stock up on a bunch of food, stock up on ammunition. Now, first of all, I can't imagine myself killing my next door neighbor to keep them from stealing my food. Second of all, if we had a nuclear war and I went to an underground bunker, and I know the Russians actually have enormous underground facilities to house millions of people, but if would you want to survive by yourself? Would you want to come out? Is it just about your personal physical survival? And I know in a sense that's not what this person is asking, but there are people who get very concerned with this. But what kind of world is that? What kind of life is that? And what's the point of it when each of us is going to die anyway? The question is, what are we contributing to make sure that the human species is immortal as a species? And how do you allow that? How do you make sure that happens? The thing that bothers me the absolutely most about the thought of nuclear annihilation is the loss of Beethoven. I just can't imagine, future generations, well, there wouldn't be any future generations, but the work of this genius not being known. So the only key for our survival is we have to ensure that the entire human race survives. And obviously there are things that we can each do as far as don't do stupid things, but and fight to educate yourself and to know what's happening in the world and to know what things can cause yourself harm. But it should become very clear now that how intertwined we are. So you need sovereign nation states to be respected, but there have to be a new kind of relations among nations which ensure the survival of every single person on the planet. if we continue to allow 23 million people in Afghanistan to die of starvation, chances are very good that we will not survive here, because what you're seeing is an intent and a policy and a total lack of regard for human life. So that's what I wanted to say about that. But Rich, perhaps you want to say something on these currency questions.
Sure. Unless Joel wants to say something first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I think that um, Diane's approach is it's not only excellent, but it's the only approach. And to build off Joel's really excellent presentation, there's a piece in which Lynn writes. He says, basically, I don't remember every sentence, but he says, if you do good deeds, ultimately, that's good, but it will be strewn to the winds. You have to make a good society, and then the deeds can live. And that's our primary job. It's the only way you can protect yourself. You have to make a society which is good and governed by the principles of science and governed by the principles of agape and reason, which are very closely linked. And sometimes people, and I don't know who asked the questions, and I know if someone's on this show listening to our show, they're probably a good person. But there comes a point at which people say, what can I do for myself, or even what can I do for my family, or what can I do for my neighborhood? And this is really where the question of mortality and immortality comes in. If you have lived your life, and I'm not saying the people who ask the question did it, because again, they're listening to our show, it must so, I think that's already a sorting out process of something showing that they're a better type of person. But if you live your life and you only live it for your pleasures and the things you accumulate in your house and maybe in your bank account, when you die, your life has ended. If you live to build mankind and the future, and you see that our necessity is to develop Africa and Haiti, and every single other country, and you think about that, you educate people about that, you do intense investigations of people who've made breakthroughs, your life doesn't end when you die. It's just beginning, because you're leaving something to mankind. You will become immortal, however small, whatever you've done. And that's the difference in thinking. LaRouche represents that possibility of being immortal. That's the only way you can protect yourself, and it'll also make you much, much happier. You will be a happier human being because you know you're doing something that you were actually put on this earth by the Creator to do in whatever 70 or 80 or 90 years you're going to live here. On the cryptocurrency, I don't want to set policy for organization, but I think it's a very destructive thing. It's completely neurotic, and it's against sovereignty. The purpose of what we outlined in the beginning is you want sovereign nations controlling sovereignty. And let me just say, whatever I said about Ukraine, it has to be within the context of a new world economic order, and as Helga LaRouche said, a new world architecture for peace based on the Treaty of Westphalia. But this says we're going to set a currency. No country can deal with it. See, because we don't trust government. Big government's all bad. I hate the Constitution. Oh, I'll bring out the Constitution book whenever I'm at a political rally, but I don't believe in the purpose of the Constitution, which is to ensure the general welfare and the good, which is what Hamilton, who set up the First National Bank, also was responsible. Not that he wrote that clause, but he guided the whole principle. Cryptocurrency is to say, I'm going to have my money and I'm not going to let anyone be at it, and I will use it against sovereign nations. The reason I said it's neurotic, and I don't want to go into the whole thing, I don't know if people know how cryptocurrency works, but the idea is you develop a linkage so that every single step, every time you use the currency, you have a record and then the next record, so that no one can interfere and steal the currency, because every record is. Now, this is so darn neurotic that they set up these places to provide the electricity for this, because each time you do another transaction, and the transactions have nothing to do with building the productive economy, raising the educational level of people, building hospitals, saving Afghanistan, saving the world. They are simply ventures. But every time you do that, you have a larger and larger algorithm. And at certain points, and people have read about this, they have entire buildings using as much electricity as, 1/10 the electricity, I think, of one of the European countries, just as they keep adding the thing. It's useless. It's insane. I've met mathematicians who believe that they're going to get the perfect system by adding all the numbers correctly. They don't understand the simplest thing about physics from the standpoint of Riemann. But it's completely destructive. I would shun it and go to sovereign currencies, however we decide that we're going to peg them. The pegging thing is useful, but it's the key thing is that we're going to vector the entire world economy to getting credit, tens of trillions of dollars, so that by 50 years from now, there is not a first, second, and third world. There's no distinction. And we're building some of the things that Joel talked about. And the third thing, let me just say, we will use gold because it has a certain disciplinary function. It means you settle your accounts in trade imbalances, but it also has something domestically. It's not a gold standard. I've been very clear on that. That's the British, that's the Swiss, that's highly deflationary. I'll just say this on it, but I won't go into it. A gold reserve means not only do you have gold, but whatever is designated as a reserve currency is also there in your pile, so that you can issue currency domestically, because it's both an international and domestic system, that's expansionary, so you can handle expansionary situations. Strictly gold, the British set out to control gold, and they kept trying to destroy America, for example, between 1865 and 1900, using the Specie Resumption Act and so forth. So it's not the gold, although gold is useful. It's the intention in which that people are saying, well, we're going to have a currency on a real basis. But again, it's nations getting together, acting sovereignly, and directing world credit flows based on the type of projects you want. So it has a place, but you have to locate its place for its purpose.
Just one thing on the cryptocurrency, the same geniuses who built 11,000 windmills in West Texas that totally failed last February during the freeze. And it wasn't just partial failure, it was a total failure. And they haven't recognized that. They're proposing that the cryptocurrency computer miners that do all these algorithms that Richie was talking about be moved to West Texas so they could use the excess electricity of the windmills to run their crypto operation. And most of these are Republicans who push this free trade, free market nonsense, not just the crazy environmentalists. So it's totally useless. But one thing I wanted to say about, you reminded me about Beethoven. You may have heard last week that the microphones on the Perseverance rover on Mars picked up a difference between high frequencies and low frequencies in the thin Martian atmosphere. Now, think of the potential that gives to choruses that could do something to survive the thin Martian atmosphere. But what would that do to the potential of writing new choruses? So just something to think about. And instead of digging bunkers in the mud, we should be looking to the stars.
Joe, are you suggesting that Diane conduct choruses on Mars? Is that part of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, this is a voluntary expedition.
As long as we know how to get back safely. Otherwise, I'll volunteer certain people to go before me.
We'll send Elon Musk on his chemical rocket, and then we'll take the fusion rocket.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, look, it is a kind of amazing time. I started by talking about this reversal of the election redistricting in New York, but on a much more profound level, you have a real backfiring of their intent. The intention of Biden, if he has an intent, I'm not sure, but the people who own him, the City of London, Prince Charles, was to crush and isolate these giant nations. But contrary to what they expected, people said, we are not going to lie down and drop dead just because you tell us to do that. And there is absolutely that kind of spirit in the United States. And I think one of the reasons why our media is so insistent on never informing Americans of anything going on in the world is that Americans would recognize that our greatest allies are 3 or 4 billion people living in other countries right now whose leadership has decided to buck a very unjust criminal genocidal system. And if you begin to see that, as in what happened in 1989, really, that what happened was the end of a system. In that case, the communist or Soviet system went bankrupt, but it was not just a country, it was systemic. And then we failed. We blew it because you had Bush Sr., Maggie Thatcher, and you had an intention to ensure that a new system did not come into being. Now that opportunity presents itself. And my greatest fear is that the American people and the people of Western Europe will not set their sights high enough to realize that what we're talking about is not just some accommodation or rearranging something within the confines of what we are used to, but that everything can be different. That you could have a system which actually is connected to a certain principle of justice and a principle of actual growth, which we have not seen in a very, very long time.
Just to pick up on that, Diane, and you're absolutely right. There has been thinking. I mentioned Sergei Glaziev because he's a very interesting figure, and he gave a speech. Well, not a speech. It was an interview on March 27th to Business Online, and he said when he was asked about Russia, India, and China, he said, "quote We are currently working on the draft international agreement on the introduction of a new world settlement currency." That's what you do when you settle trade imbalances and so forth. You settle it in currency. Pegged to the national currencies of the participating countries and to exchange traded goods that determine real values. Objectively, the ruble could become a reserve currency, along with the yuan, which is the Chinese currency, and when it deals with internationally, it's called the renminbi, it's the same currency, and the rupee. It would be possible to switch to multi-currency systems based on national currencies, but you still need some equivalent for pricing. Now, he then does discuss the question of gold as well, but this is something he talks about. Look at the trajectory of our organization. In 2001, Sergei Glaziev had Lyndon LaRouche testify to the Duma, the Russian government, the new government, on the proposals that Lynn was working on, which for world development and how you would do this. And when Lynn died, Lyndon LaRouche, Glaziev wrote a very powerful statement. And he said that Lyndon LaRouche was one of the great thinkers of our time. Now, here's a person who's in the middle of this. That's how we organize. We organize everyone. We organize people on the street. We organize people in the grocery store. Some of our members will get into a cab and start organizing the cab driver. They just, they're made that way. But we organize thinkers who think for the future. And this person and a few others, Justin Lin Yufu, who's also working on this question, who was the chief economist of the IMF, who is runs an institute at Beijing University. These people we've met over the years doing real fights for this stuff. They're in the middle of this. They have been forced to do this. But this is something, they've been forced to do it. But this is something they've been thinking about. If they do this, if we move to a new RIC-centered world system, but it's got to be the principles of Lyndon LaRouche, it will do something that we should have done 20 or 30 years ago. But think of the reverse. This will blow out the dollar. What's that going to do to America? How smart was the sanction policy based on using this dollar dominance? How smart? Hopefully, after the dust clears when something like that happens, and it will happen, unless literally the button is pushed on several nuclear warheads, at British instigation with America acting as the dumb giant. Hopefully, because we do not want two blocks, we want to bring America back into this. And Xi Jinping has been absolutely clear. He keeps saying, have America come back into this arrangement. He's offered the Belt and Road, which is probably the greatest manifestation of this higher principle that's existing right now. So it will, but the thing is, it will happen. We could do that voluntarily tomorrow as a nation. But if we don't, we're going to go through a tremendous amount of misery. And then hopefully we will have the wisdom then to join this system. But this is a change in the world. The crazy imperial thinking are pushing their own demise because they do not believe in real economics and they don't believe in human creativity and they can't see the potential. But they're going to shove themselves out the window. But unfortunately, the Americans who are watching this, we're going to be the grand recipients of this grand stupidity.
Thanks. Joel, any thoughts?
Oh, yeah. For those who thought that the Americans can no longer work with Russians, just yesterday, the American astronaut, Dan Hay, came back after almost 1 year on the International Space Station. He came back on the Soyuz capsule with 2 Russian cosmonauts. And as far as I heard, they were all alive when they landed in Kazakhstan. So the potential to work with the Russians has been there. And we have to go back to that tradition. Because if you think back to what the US did, we did land a man on the moon. I remember that because I was 10 years old when Neil Armstrong took that giant leap for mankind. That type of program inspires people to study real science, not political sociology, like what they teach at West Point right now. So we have to go back to what actually built this country, inspired other nations, and inspired other people to try to imitate the United States, not as the bully on the block, but as the leader who can take us into space and beyond the moon and Mars.
Great. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. I just really want to reiterate that I put in the comments and the chat, both in YouTube and Facebook, the link for the Schiller Institute website where you can get the document that Rich Freeman is the co-author of on this new economic architecture. And you can register for the April 9th conference, which does not cost anything. It's an online video conference. I would really encourage everyone to do that. Finally, as of this coming Tuesday, the petitioning for my candidacy will begin with the still unchanged, hopefully it will change, but I wouldn't count on it, requirement of 45,000 signatures of registered New York voters. So if you would like to help with the petitioning, if you live in New York and are a New York voter, we need you. If you are somewhere else in the country and you'd like to come in and help, we need you. And I urgently need funds for my campaign because during the petitioning period, I'm not going to have time to really concentrate on that. So we're really trying to front load the fundraising for the campaign. So anyone who is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you can go to sareforsenate.com. And again, that's in the comment sections, both on YouTube and Facebook. And please donate whatever you can. You can give a small monthly amount. You can give up to $2,900, but whatever you can will really help us to kick this off. I just am putting in an order right now for 100,000 palm cards and all kinds of exciting literature. So thanks very much. Thanks, Richard Freeman. Thanks, Joel Dejean. And I hope that we are
That's a much better it's a much better investment than Bitcoin.
Yes, yes. And with any luck, I'll be able to come back here next week and we'll see how we're doing. So good night, everybody.
Right.